OK, let's speak to Gareth Redmond-King from the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, a non-profit organisation that offers advice to Parliament and journalists. Thanks for coming on the programme.
Hi there.
So first of all, tell us, for people watching that will have been used to hearing reports on climate change and warnings on climate change, what's interesting or important about this particular report?
I think it's the scale of the report. This is only the first such comprehensive report of where the world is on globally on climate change since 2014. And of course, that last assessment report in 2014 that fed into the Paris Agreement in 2015. We won't see another one of these assessments until probably the end of this decade. And this decade is, as you've just noted, critical for actually keeping within that limit that was set in the Paris Agreement. We have to halve emissions this decade if we stand a hope of getting to net zero by the middle of the century and keeping that global heating to 1.5 degrees. So this report informs the work of the UN climate process over the next few years, over this crucial decade.
OK.
And it informs... Sorry, go on.
Well, on that then, let's have a look at some of the solutions. The report mentions that actually lots of the technology we have as human beings, and we just need to use it. What are some of the examples that it's talking about?
Well, it's very clear as well about just how cheap some of those tools are. They are now much cheaper than the fossil fuel alternatives that we seem still to be cleaving to rather too much. So things like solar power, things like wind power, things like heat pumps to decarbonize heating in homes, things like just building better homes, energy efficiency measures that actually prevent buildings from leaking heat in the first place. All of these solutions have been available to us for the best part of this decade. They've been getting cheaper and cheaper, and most of them have long since slid below their fossil fuel alternatives.
But isn't part of the problem they still require that upfront cost? We all know how good insulation is for homes and buildings, but it still requires that cost to put it in, which explains perhaps some of the delay.
But one of the things that this report is clear about as well is that overall the price for implementing these measures, these tools that we have, is less than the cost that we will bear from the impacts, the benefits that we reap from implementing, using these tools in terms of improved health, not just straightforwardly avoiding the climate impacts, but also just wider benefits for human beings, for nature, for the planet. The cost of not doing those things is much, much greater than the upfront cost that governments need to invest. And of course, we've seen governments, here in the UK, we've seen governments support technologies like offshore wind. A decade, 15 years ago, people were saying, well, offshore wind, it's ridiculously expensive. It'll never take off. It's more expensive than nuclear. But that upfront subsidy leverages huge amounts then of private investment, which mobilizes the technology develops, the supply chain comes to the places where it's being deployed, the costs fall, and suddenly not only are you deploying it at the scale that you need to in countries with high emissions, but you're making the technology cheaper for everybody else to be able to deploy it as well.
All right, Gareth, stay with us. I want to go to the US and get the American perspective, because, Amanda, this has been a huge part of President Biden's policy.
Yeah, in fact, when I read the report, it sounded a bit like his talking points on the White House lawn when he was talking about the $370 billion investment that he was putting towards climate and clean energy. And what I will say is, being in that lawn and you looked across, I'm not sure I've been in an environment where you had business, labor, civil rights groups, advocacy groups, all coming together to say, this is a moment, we have what we need, we see prices are coming down, have come down, and we are here in lockstep to make this the new industry here in the United States. There was a really beautiful moment there, and I think we've got to now move faster as I read this report, but I think this will come to many of those same people in that room as a welcomed report and action of urgency right now to do more with what is already in our expertise, but now using those investments for good.
Tom, here in the UK, Glasgow hosted that big climate change conference, of course, and there was a big political will and political support behind keeping 1.5 alive. I think that was the phrase at the time. It's going to take a lot of effort to keep 1.5 alive.
Of course it is, but sadly, not much of it can possibly come from this country. We have a pretty impressive track record on this stuff. Greenhouse gas emissions in the UK are 66% down on what they were 20 years ago. But globally, the figure has gone up 66% in that same time frame. And obviously, the UK is a tiny part of that. That 66% number globally is enormous. These reports seem to come in. I know that there's different types, but the IPCC are always publishing reports, each one more terrifying than the last. And I'm afraid for little old me in Little Britain, I feel rather powerless reading them all. This is not something in which the UK is likely to be. It needs the big countries with huge populations, huge emissions, huge manufacturing bases. China obviously manufactures everything for the world, which disguises other countries' emissions to a certain extent. It surprises me, given that lots of the stuff that we've talked about so far on the show concerns fracturing of global consensus. And this should be the thing that really, in the future, has to bring the world together, because everybody is in the same boat. Everybody is exposed to the same consequences. And I cannot believe the consensus on this can't be found. And it's so clear that more needs to be done. But in Westminster, I follow all the debates and I get interested in the new insulation projects, but all the while knowing that we are not a big player in this.
Well, Gareth, let's come back to you on exactly that point, because however much everyone in certain countries which don't emit as much play their part, and you look at countries like China and India, it's really down to them, isn't it?
I think it's perfectly reasonable to say that the UK has done well on cutting emissions, and to say that the UK, well, we're only 1% of emissions. We're actually probably double that, maybe slightly more, if you take into account the emissions that we effectively export overseas in terms of the products and that we import. But also, we're the sixth biggest GDP in the world. We are a big player economically. We, the thing I just described in terms of offshore wind, that's the UK being a big player and being a leader and having much, punching above its weight, if you like, in terms of the global impact that it can have. And it's also it's true to say that if you group together the countries that are only about 1 or 2% of emissions, you end up with 30–40% of emissions. So, if everybody kind of sits back and goes, well, it's only the big countries, then we leave a very big hole in terms of action. But also those big countries are taking action. We've heard about that, the US committing 369 billion is phenomenal in terms of a step change in action. It's actually maybe something more like 500 billion when you group together some other pieces of legislation that the Biden administration has passed. The European Union is almost certainly going to overshoot the targets that it's committed to because of the action that it's taking to get off Russian oil and gas. India has a huge partnership with Germany to spend billions of pounds to hasten its transition away from coal, and has huge private investment going in to speed the transition. And China is deploying renewables at a rate that dwarfs what's going on in the rest of the world. So that's the 4 biggest emitters globally are taking very significant action. So it's not as if we're only acting on our own.
Okay, Gareth, Redmond-King, great to have you on. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.